Hello. Sorry if I said that too loud. This is Unit 5, the Cognition Unit, and we are actually about to now start covering the Module 32, which is storing and retrieving memories. Let's make sure I pull it up here. All right, storing and retrieving memories. We are going to be learning about long-term memories, more specifically, their capacity and their location. We're going to be talking about the parts of the brain that are involved with our long-term memories and where they're stored. And we're going to learn about the synaptic level, like actually how learning occurs from a neurological standpoint. And we're going to look at some of the influences and limitations of things like emotions and retrieval cues. When you're thinking about memory, think about maybe, just as an example, your favorite childhood memory. And just it's interesting to ponder what's more important, the experience or the memory of it. I mean, sometimes we feel like the memory lasts longer, but yet that's not the actual physical experience. So we are going to first review what is a long-term memory. You learn that in Module 31, that you have things that come in your sensory memory, and then they could potentially go to your short-term memory. And then if you're lucky enough, it goes to your long-term memory. Your long-term memories are limitless. They even make a reference that it's the same ballpark as the World Wide Web, like how much actual information could potentially be stored in your long-term memory. So they, work with animals a lot just to kind of study and understand things like long-term memory. And in 1950, they trained rats to learn how to go through a maze, and then they surgically removed pieces of their cortex and then retested to see if they could go through the maze. And they found that even when they took different parts of the brain, they were removed, they were still able to partially navigate and get through the maze. They still had learned. So they realized that the brain stores memories in different places. So there's different parts of the brain that are going to be involved, and we're going to be learning those. One part is the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is where we also we can store and process some of our explicit memories. But let's review what explicit memories are again. Explicit memories, we call them declarative memories. You declare them, meaning that you're consciously aware of them. You're actively kind of thinking about them. Two types are semantic and episodic. Semantic memories are for facts and general knowledge. So just knowing that George Washington was the first president, that's like a piece of factual information, and that is an explicit memory. And then an episodic memory is more like episodes, events, things that have happened in your life that you remember. So your 6th birthday party, that would be an example of an episodic memory. Or remember at the beginning of this module, I asked you to think about what's your favorite childhood memory. So that would be more of an episodic. So in the left frontal lobe, not that you have to memorize left versus right or semantic versus episodic, but you want to understand that different parts even of the frontal lobe are going to be different in the processing of memories. So the recalling a password and holding it in your working memory, that would be activating like the left frontal lobe, which is a semantic memory. And then the right frontal lobe, when you're visualizing a party and the scene of that party, that would be an episodic memory and in the right. But we know when we primarily think of memory, we tend to think of a hippo never forgets, the hippocampus. And then for those of you who are like, what the heck is she talking about? It's not a hippo, it's an elephant. That's just a little memory aid that I use sometimes to try to, remember that the hippocampus is a part of the brain. It's in the temporal lobe that is where, we can store explicit and episodic memories. or semantic and episodic, which are explicit memories. And it is a part of the limbic system, remember, which is the limbic system is the part of the brain that it has to do with emotions, like we call it the emotion center. So neuroscientists have found that the hippocampus, it's like a save button for explicit memories. Okay, so you have, that favorite childhood memory and it got saved in the hippocampus. And, but it's going to go to other regions as well. So here's some other specifics about the hippocampus. Is certain regions might be more involved with like social information, those types of memories. Another part of the hippocampus could be involved in like spatial memories. Just remember we talked about like mental maps and things like that. So they noticed that here's another study, the London cab drivers, that they noticed that they had their spatial memory was growing bigger, and that particular hippocampal region of the brain was growing, like as they started to really understand and know and get through the complicated maze of streets in London. So hippocampus plays a key role in memories. All right, so memories are not permanently stored. They call it like a loading dock, where the brain registers and holds the elements to be remembered, the smell, the feel, the sound, the location. So it's like having a basement storeroom, and then they migrate for storage elsewhere. So it's going to start there, and then it's going to kind of go to other regions. And the process itself is called memory consolidation. And this will make a little more sense with the next slide. So sleep, so important for that memory consolidation. It is researchers watch the hippocampus and brain cortex displaying simultaneously activity rhythms during sleep. So it's almost like they're simultaneously like consolidating, talking and communicating, to kind of put everything together for you to later retrieve that memory. So it's playing the day's experiences and transferring them to the cortex for long-term storage. So learning distributed over days rather than cramming. All right, so you're learning this now, but you want to go back over it, or you want to kind of spread it out as much as you can. That is, helping the sleep is going to help with that consolidation. But like I said, spreading it over days as opposed to cramming, we call that the spacing effect. And it is going to help you recall easier and faster. All right, so we talked about explicit memories, which are those declarative memories that you're conscious of, like for facts and for events. But there is another type of memories, and those are processed in different locations. And they are not, it's not in the hippocampus and the frontal lobe. So implicit memories are automatic processing for skills and newly conditioned associations. And we'll talk about that more, because you may be confused. I love the story. So let me explain this one rather than just reading it out here. Okay, so there was a woman that had very serious amnesia, and remember, like with like the hippocampus, explicit memories, couldn't remember the past, has trouble making new memories, things like that. And she went to go see the same doctor every day. He would always put out his hand, hi, how are you? And one time when he put out his hand and they went to shake hands, he had a tack. I am not sure why, but he had a tack. And when he went to shake her hand, it poked her. And, she retracted her hand and, kind of pulled back. And what happened was it had created a classically conditioned response, which we would naturally do. When somebody pokes you, you naturally kind of pull away. And they noticed the next day when he went to put out his hand to shake her hand, she immediately just like pulled her hand back. And it was because she had an implicit long-term memory, and she didn't know who he is, because remember, she's got amnesia. She couldn't recall the event from the day before when she got poked, but she just somehow knew to pull her hand away. That is an implicit memory. So where are those located? Those are located in the cerebellum and another place, basal ganglia, we'll talk about in a second. The cerebellum, I use that as a little memory aid. When I think of the cerebellum, I think of like balancing myself like I'm on a surfboard or something, because it has to do with balance and coordinated movement. But we also know now that our implicit memories are also stored there as well. And so certain types of learning, like classical conditioned responses, like the one I just gave an example of, are in the cerebellum. So here's another example of a conditioned response. So if I did a little experiment with you, I turn a light on and then I like have this puff of air go to your eye. Eventually all I have to do is turn the light on and you would immediately just close your eyes because you don't want that puff of air. Anticipation of the puff. That's classical conditioning. And that is you're creating an implicit memory, remember, stored in the cerebellum. If we damaged your cerebellum, that you would not have that implicit memory. So we turn the light on, even though you already had it happen to you like 3 or 4 times before where you get this puff of air to your eye, because you don't have that implicit memory, you are not going to close your eyes, okay? So you don't want to damage that cerebellum for many reasons. All right, so another part that has to do with implicit memories is called the basal ganglia. It's a brain structure involved with motor movements as well, like more specifically your motor movements, but it's involved with your procedural memories. So when we mean procedural memories, it means like things just to be able to walk and talk and, you know, writing and tying your shoe and all that stuff. You're just kind of doing it automatically. Notice it says non-declarative. It's implicit. And so just think automatic memories, things that obviously you need to have a memory to know how to like walk and talk and do certain things, but it's not like you're consciously thinking about it. And the basal ganglia just does not send the information for you to be consciously aware of it. All right, so another term here, we got something called infantile amnesia. So as adults, our conscious memory of our first 4 years is largely blank. If you remember things from like being 2 years old or 1 year old, most likely it is a constructed memory that came from like your parents talking about experiences when you're little. Oh, when you're 2, you did this. It's normally not your actual like memory, even as strong as it feels like it is, most likely not. Because, and let me explain why. First off, your language for you to articulate and reflect and think about those experiences is not as developed. So that certainly is going to play a part with you not being able to remember things and having amnesia in the future. And also your hippocampus is not developed enough for you to be able to have and retain those memories. Okay. All right, another part of the brain. All right, we got one more. The amygdala, but it's a lot of this. Okay, I need to work on my acting skills clearly, but I was trying to demonstrate the amygdala has to do with 2 primary functions: fear and kind of like aggressive kind of emotional responses, very much linked to emotion, right? And that is going to play a part in memory as well. So it's a lima bean sized neural cluster in the limbic system. All right, how does it play a role in memory processing? So this is interesting. We found if you have a very kind of significant event happen, you are going to release stress hormones. And when that happens, it actually makes the memory you're more focused, like intensely focused. And it like boosts activity in the brain's memory forming areas. So it's just kind of enhancing that whole memory effect. So it says here, if the amygdala says, brain, encode this moment for future reference. And the result Emotional arousal can sear certain events. Sear means like just like make it more intense into the brain while disrupting memory for irrelevant events. So you might not remember all the other things that were happening around you except for that immediate experience. Here are all those different parts of the brain. You are going to want to spend some time going back over them. Let's just do a quick little question here, and I'm going to give you more details about that. What two parts of the brain are most involved in implicit memory? See if you can remember which ones. Cerebellum and the basal ganglia. That is D. Okay. All right, so emotions affect our emotional processing. We just talked about that with the amygdala. You focus your attention and recall on high priority information and reduce or recall of irrelevant details. Right. It's just, it makes perfect sense. It's like a tunnel vision memory for things that are emotional and significant. Right. So what rivets our attention gets well recalled at the expense of the surrounding context. So here's an example. I think we already talked about this in one of my Zoom meetings already. But another, when we're talking about an emotionally significant event, we also sometimes reference it as a flashbulb memory. An example here, Donald Trump won the 2000 presidential election. Do you remember what you were doing, where you were, who you were with? You probably do, because it was a very emotional event for a lot of people. And they're clear, sustained, long-term memory of an emotionally. So the key here with flashbulb memories, they're emotionally significant events. We've over years, we asked people these questions depending upon like some significant event that maybe happened nationally. I used to years ago ask my students after 2001, I'd be like, do you remember where you were, when you found out about, the Twin Towers going down or being hit by the planes? And, they would recall very vivid memories of their parents, coming to pick them up and watching TV and stuff like that. All right, so that's a flashbulb memory. So here we have some other research working with animals. These are called Aplysia. It's a California sea slug. And Eric Kandel, he is one of the names in your slide deck, this unit, so pay attention. He was trying to understand the neural basis. So we also need to understand what is actually happening neurologically. We talked about the different parts of the brain, but we also want to talk about what's happening with the neurons themselves and creating those neural connections. So he noticed synaptic changes during learning. So remember, they're learning something. And I think with aplysia, they might learn to do some classically conditioned response where they retract their gills when the water is sprayed on them. So they notice that once they really learn, it becomes a learned response, that they release more serotonin in the neurons, and they actually increase the number of like neural connections. So it makes things more efficient. Sorry, I should read this. These cell synapses then become more efficient at transmitting signals. We want things, the more efficient things are, the quicker you can kind of respond and understand. So we're going to talk about this. I feel like I should read this one out. I don't like to generally read long slides, but this one will kind of explain it after I talk about it. We read it. In experiments with people, rapidly stimulating certain memory circuit connections has increased their sensitivity for hours or even weeks to come. The sending neuron now needs less prompting to release its neurotransmitter, and more connections exist between the neurons. The key things you want to pay attention here is there needs to be less prompting to release a neurotransmitter, which is obviously important to send the message on. And also there's more connections existing between. So there's more connections where those neurons can be sending the message to all the other neurons, right? So we call this increased efficiency LTP, or long-term potentiation. It is basically the neural explanation of how, when you learn something and you know something really well and you can respond to it really quickly to questions, or you can talk about it very actively with confidence, that the long term, the LTP is the neural explanation for that. An increase in a cell's firing potential. So you have much more potential and more neural connections the more you learn something. That's LTP. One is long-term potentiation. And learning, I like to remember it as learning is brain food. You know, the more you learn and know something, you're creating, you know, increasing the neural potential of you know, the communication between other neurons. So this is what it looks like. So when you first learn something, you might only have one receptor site, which is here, figure A, or you know, picture A. Picture B, there's more receptor sites. So the neurotransmitter now has two places to go, the neurotransmitters, to send the message even more quickly, you know, to the other neurons, and more neurons are going to be involved. So they, you know, also look at drugs and how they affect LTP. So drugs that block it, obviously you're having more difficulty learning something. And I don't know if you remember, block, we call an antagonist, right? And then an agonist is a drug that mimics the learning, so it actually increases the LTP. And they found that, like rats that were given a drug that enhanced it, that they were able to go through a maze much more quickly with half of the mistakes. So this is another little try it. This is a really important diagram. We're going to talk about this, and I'll show it to you on the slides in the Zoom class, because it really is a good way to kind of break down and understand automatic memories versus effortful, you know, where they're located in the brain, you know, what are the different types. So we're also going to talk about memory retrieval. How do you actually retrieve memory? They're in long-term memory, and now you just need to pull them out, and you got to do them, you know, do that with efficiency. So there's different things. They're called retrieval cues. So when you encode into memory a target piece of information, such as the name of a person sitting next to you, you associate with it other bits of information about your surroundings. So it's not just the name you're trying to remember, but you also start taking in the other information about, you know, the mood you're in, you know, where you are, maybe even the smells or other like experiences. And the bits can serve as retrieval cues to help you, you know, remember that person's name in the future. The best retrieval cues come from associations we form at the time we encode a memory, a smell, a taste, a sight. And it's going to help you associate something. So, and you guys know, I sometimes call them smemories. Like sometimes you smell something and it's like, oh, it reminds me of my grandma, and, you know, being at her house for the summer, and, you know, stuff like that. To call up visual cues, and then another retrieval cue is when you actually place yourself back into the physical environment of where you were. So like, let's say you are trying to, you know, remember something about your grandmother. So you put yourself back into your grandmother's home visually to help you remember. All right, so priming is one way. The activation, often unconsciously, of particular associations in long-term implicit memory. So you know, a lot of times when I think of the word priming, I just immediately think of like associations and things that we might do automatically without thinking about it. Don't confuse it with perceptual set, because this is more of an implicit memory. Perceptual set is more of just an expectation that's going to influence you in the future. So how does priming work? We did show examples of this before, but it is involved with implicit memory, so we'll repeat it. So the example here, you're seeing or hearing the word rabbit. So it activates an association, a connection with rabbits. And then when somebody later on says the word, how do you spell hare? Because you've been primed, you know, to make those association with the rabbit, you're going to more likely maybe say H-A-R-E. How does understanding of long-term implicit memory help you understand priming and the relationship? I'm going to give you another little example here. It's a little odd of an example, but it's actually supposed to be demonstrating how we sometimes have implicit biases. You've maybe heard that term in the past. that we sometimes make these associations and connections and we're not even aware of it. Right, so this is, you're walking down a hallway, you see a poster of a missing child. You may then unconsciously be primed to interpret an ambiguous adult child. Ambiguous means like there's not, you don't really know what's happening. It's, you know, anything, but you just immediately start making some, as a possible kidnapping, you start associating and because you've been primed that you maybe just feel uncomfortable and you're not even remembering why. Another example here, you got the priming effect. You have food items here, but then somebody says, could you fill in the blank here? And then you're like, oh, that's soap. I mean, not soap, prime with the other one. Soup, S-O-U-P. But then if you are given beforehand all these words that are associated with like, you know, taking a shower and stuff like that, that you would fill in the blank to be soap, S-O-A-P. So that's the priming effect. So not just priming is a retrieval cue, or it's going to make you, you know, associate certain things and have these implicit memories. You also, the context, as I mentioned early on, just a little while ago, is that when you put yourself back into the actual context in which you learned something, it can help you retrieve the memories. So I love to give the best example is, you know, unfortunately, most likely you're going to probably be in the auditorium when you take the AP exam. You're not going to be in the room where you've maybe spent a lot of your Zoom meetings and all that stuff and doing your homework. But you could visually put yourself back into your room when you sit into the auditorium initially to kind of help as a retrieval cue to try to pull up and recall as much as you can about AP psychology. So I love this. This is an interesting example here. Scuba divers listen to a word list in 2 different settings, either 10 feet underwater or sitting on the beach, and they recalled more words if tested in the same place. So they had to memorize some words, and if they learned them, you know, underwater or sitting on the beach, it was much better to be in the actual context when they had to recall them to help them recall as many as they could. So John noticed he did better on the chemistry exams when he takes them in the same seat that he sits in during class. If he is properly prepared for each exam, then the blank may help explain his difference in scores. I knew you would get it. It's B, context effects. So one thing, it can kind of stump you sometimes though, when you're not in the context. So the example they're giving you here is like, you know how sometimes you run into a teacher at the mall and you're like, oh, I know you, but it's like you kind of can't remember exactly who it is at first because you are not in the same context. So if you know, somehow put yourself back into the classroom, you'll all of a sudden remember the teacher's name. This is a new term this year, so we'll talk about it. It's called the encoding specificity principle, and it just means that cues and context specific to a particular memory will be most effective in helping us recall it. So it is just saying that, you know, using those retrieval cues, you know, understanding context and how it can influence and help your memory, and we actually call that the encoding specificity principle. You know, it's like a theory. All right, just got a couple more here. State dependent memory. That what we learn in one physiological state, for example, energy level from having a cup of coffee, you will be more likely to remember what you learned with 1 cup of coffee, same physiological states. So meaning that if you learned something and you had a cup of coffee and you had to learn state dependent memory, you're going to be more likely to be able to remember what state dependent memory with a cup of coffee in the future. Physiological state, right? Another example here, you're on a treadmill, which gives you a certain physiological state of like heart rate. So when you're trying to recall the information, it's good to be at that same heart rate. This is called mood congruent memory, and this is the tendency to recall experiences that are consistent with one's current good or bad emotional state. So this just means that when you're in a particular mood, you're going to be more likely to recall memories that are congruent or similar to that mood. And we're going to talk about the negative side of that and the positive. Okay, so we'll start with if you're sad or you are in a state of some level of depression, what is happening is you're more likely to recall sad events, negative aspects, negative relationships, more of those sad things that are congruent with your present mood. And it can be a cycle. You're sad, you keep thinking of sad things, which makes you sad. You see how it's a cycle, all right? So the other side, if we know that, we also know when we're happy, you're going to be more likely to be thinking of happy things, recalling happy events, experiences, and relationships, right? And that cycle. So the good news here is your awareness, your understanding, you're learning all these things in this psychology class. The awareness is the first step to make positive change. So I know it's sometimes really hard, but if you are feeling sad, sometimes you're pulling up a lot of negative thoughts and memories and all that, you'll be like, oh, all right, I know what's happening. I got this mood congruent memory thing going on. All right, I need to change that up a little bit. And so then you just kind of put yourself and find something to kind of help lift your mood a little bit to create that little bit more of a positive cycle. But always ask for help as well. Those close friends or family members sometimes that you just reach out to, just be like, hey, can you help lift my mood a little bit? Like make me laugh or do something. So, all right. Last term today, I promise. This is called the serial position effect. All right, so we're going to do a little last minute activity here before I really talk about the serial position effect. I'm going to give you 30 seconds to study this list. All right, that I'm going to show you in a second, and then we'll talk about it. All right, so ready, set, go. And get a piece of paper too. I'll give you a couple extra seconds. Get that paper. All right, so get that piece of paper and see how many you can remember, or maybe even just off the top of your head. I know we're kind of at the end of this video and you might be tired of learning. But the point is that most likely what you remember is the stuff at the beginning and the stuff at the end, the words at the beginning and the words at the end. And you're more likely to forget the items in the middle. So let's go back here real quick. So the serial position effect is your tendency to recall best, the last, which is called the recency effect. You tend to remember things that you just most recently learned. And first, which is the primacy effect in a list. So the primacy is the stuff at the beginning. So let's look at this list as my example. So you're going to be more likely to remember these words, okay? Less likely to remember, and more likely to remember these words. So the primacy effect is the first words, and the recency effect is the most recent stuff. So it would be the last words. And you're going to be more likely to forget the stuff in the middle. All right. And that is, it's called the serial position effect. It's just, one other thing, just your own awareness when you're studying, it's good to mix up your notes. Don't just like always start from the beginning, because then maybe you get tired and, you just start forgetting the stuff in the middle. So mix it up. All right, so I think we have one other slide here. In experiments, when people viewed a list of words, dates, and even experienced odors, immediately, this is in the way, they are more likely to remember, or they're going to fall prey to the serial position effect. And here, let's move here, that they are going to recall quickly and well the most recent things that they remember, and also the first items. And one of the things with the primacy effect, they do remember, you tend to remember things at the beginning because you kind of keep rehearsing them. You know, if you start at the beginning of the list, you kind of just you're more likely to rehearse those items. All right, so last question. Which of the following is an example of the serial position effect? It is C, remembering the beginning and the end of your grocery list. All right, I think that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed the video. I wish you the best of luck on your assessment today. I know sometimes watching these videos can be long and maybe even a little boring, but they do have some benefits. So, all right, take care. Bye.